I'm Carrie Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Commission on Women. I'm part of the planning committee for this conference. Thank you all so much for coming. It's just so heartwarming to see everybody here after so many months of planning. And I was the one who kind of coordinated this panel, so I'm going to introduce the moderator, and then I'm going to step out of the way and let them all take it from there. We're very, very fortunate. Cheers! 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 Seltzer. She must be special. Well, I'm so grateful that we have Andrea Johnson here from the National Women's Law Center, and she's told me her title and I instantly forgot it. Senior Counsel for State Policy, and at the Vermont Commission on Women, we've had the pleasure of working directly with Andrea as well as with the center on accommodations for pregnant employees as well as some other issues. And so she's going to moderate our panel today and introduce you to the rest of our panelists.
Thank you. Okay, so some of you might have been in the equal pay panel and heard me already once before. I have a different shtick for this one, so I'll keep it exciting. But yes, I'm very excited to be here. For those of you who aren't familiar with the National Women's Law Center, we've been working for over 45 years to champion laws and policies that help women and girls throughout their lives achieve their potential. So at school, at home, and at work. And I realize maybe you want me for the video. Oops, sorry about that. To be doing this. It's not on, but it's on for the camera purposes. So, and yes, as Carrie said, I work with state advocates and legislators and local legislators as well to help advance policies that improve women's and families' economic security. So, since you're attending this conference and this panel, I suspect that you will all agree with me that this past year, the hashtag #MeToo, with that going viral, it's been an absolute whirlwind. It's definitely been an emotional whirlwind. For many of us, some of us have shared our own Me Too stories of harassment or supported family, friends, or coworkers who have shared theirs, bravely stepped up and shared theirs. Some of us have dealt with retaliation and backlash. We've had emotional ups and downs as we've seen the power of survivors coming together to share their stories, leading to really important moments of accountability. And we've watched the powerful demonstrations of solidarity across the country to believe survivors during the Kavanaugh hearings. But then to be disappointed, yet again, by our systems and institutions' failure to hold harassers accountable. As I've heard some folks say, it's been a century of a year. I think that sums it up well. It's also been a physical whirlwind. I know many of us have been putting in very long hours, working to meet the courage of survivors with real institutional and policy reforms. And things I can tell you have been pretty intense at the National Women's Law Center because on January 1 of this year, so yeah, not that long ago, we started housing and administering the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which some of you might have heard of. The fund connects those who experience sexual misconduct in the workplace with legal assistance and helps defray attorneys' fees and costs. Since the fund was launched, over 3,500 people from all over the country and over 60 different industries have reached out for assistance, many of them empowered by the Me Too movement to do so. And we are also working with local, state, and federal legislators in some of the well over 100 bills that have been introduced in legislatures across the country to stop and prevent sexual harassment in our workplaces. And that's a lot of the work that I'm doing as Senior Counsel for State Policy. And I'm really honored to be moderating this panel today with some of the leaders who have been working on those policies. And they aren't only leaders in their states on these issues, they are national leaders because Congress isn't passing legislation to address sexual harassment. They're working on some, but it's, as we all know, Congress is really held up by partisan gridlock, and there are so many inadequacies in our current laws and they need to be rectified. But states and localities are really taking charge and working hard to pass meaningful reforms. This last legislative session, we saw states working on a number of different things, like ensuring that all workers are covered by sexual harassment protections. That just basic idea of making sure everybody's, because a lot of state laws and the federal law carve out workers like independent contractors or interns or volunteers or employees who work for smaller employers. So making sure that everybody's protected is a really important basic first step. We saw states working to restore survivors' voice and limit the tools employers have been using to force survivors into silence, as we saw so disturbingly with Harvey Weinstein, and really sweeping harassment under the rug by using things like non-disclosure agreements or forced arbitration. And we've seen states seeking to remove barriers to access to justice, one of those things being extending the statute of limitations for bringing a claim, which is oftentimes less than 1 year. And if you're dealing with the trauma of being harassed or assaulted, it can be incredibly difficult for a victim to come forward. Or you're dealing with the fear of reporting. Oftentimes that short statute of limitations is just not enough. And I think we've heard so many Me Too stories, or the story of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, where it takes many, many years for a survivor to come forward. So extending the statute of limitations is very important. We've seen states working on prevention as well, and this includes requiring private and public employers to conduct regular mandatory anti-harassment training. And I know there's a lot of research out there about how training has not been effective. A lot of it has been very compliance-focused and more like, here's the law, comply. It's not necessarily in person. It's not necessarily focused on examples relevant to that specific workplace. It doesn't necessarily include bystander intervention training. All of those things are incredibly important, and so that's an area of policy movement we're seeing as well. So this session, Washington, New York, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Vermont were some of the states, not the only states, but some of them, that passed legislation in several of these areas this past session. And we have a report you can find online that kind of breaks down who did what, called Me Too 1 year later. I think hashtag Me Too 1 year later. But there's still so much more work to be done in these states as well, and all the others. And I brought with me, and I'll leave here at the table afterwards, our state playbook for gender equity, which includes a long list of legislative policies we need to stop and prevent sexual harassment. We tried to make it as succinct as possible, but there's just so much to be done, and because this issue's gone unaddressed for a long time. And before I turn it over to our panelists, I'll say that on the anniversary of the Me Too hashtag going viral, so just a few weeks ago in October, nearly 300 organizations signed a call to action published in the New York Times, and Tarana Burke was part of this, who we heard earlier, challenging 20 states by 2020 to pass laws strengthening legal protections against sexual harassment and violence. That's a very exciting charge. 2020 is not that far away, but I'm honored to be here with representatives from some of the states that are working hard, I'm sure, to be among the 20. So we have Rhode Island State Representative Teresa Tanzi, Vermont State Representative Sarah Copeland-Hanzas, Vermont Commission on Women, are you a commissioner? Yes. Lisa Seneca, and Maine Women's Lobby Executive Director Eliza Townsend. And did I get the organization right? I'm sorry for that. We probably should have checked this out beforehand. Anyway, I'm very excited to have them all here, and I want to kick off the conversation by asking you, what do the Me Too awakening and reckoning look like in your state? What caused the Me Too conversations to take off in your state, and what did those conversations look like? If you want to start.
Sure. It started with a loud bang. I honestly, perhaps naively, disclosed my story standing in a supermarket while I was shopping for, hand soap or something, and my phone rang, and I try to answer my phone every time it rings, and it wasn't a number that I recognized. Turns out it was a reporter for the Providence Journal, and I had never really spoken to this individual, and she said, I saw your post last night on Twitter about Me Too, and my post had nothing to do with my own personal experiences. It was something along the lines of, if I hear one more guy say, well, as the father of a daughter, I was going to scream, because we need fathers with sons to be just as caring about this issue. And so she called me and just caught me at a moment where I ran off about a multitude of experiences that I have had. In the State House, I just got elected to my 5th term. I'm very excited about that. Other my House leadership, not quite as excited to have me back. But, it really, I disclosed something that was far more salacious than I thought of, even as I was experiencing it. And it took off from there, created a life of its own. Of course, I did not think I would be the only one to share it. I thought that the hundreds of women whose stories I heard prior to me opening my mouth were going to jump behind me and say, yes, me too, that happened to me. Nobody else did. So it made for some very difficult conversations, and it's still difficult 13 months later, I have to say. But there was some great fruit that came out of it. We created a commission to look at laws that are very antiquated, much in need of updating, as Andrea was saying. And we put out an amazing product. We put forward 9 bills to be considered. And if I had, been given the time and space to do this on my own, they would have been far more comprehensive, far more restrictive. We would have gone, like 5 miles further down the road. But I knew time was short. I knew that this window wasn't going to stay open forever. So I found compromise. I went right for the middle on everything, and I said it time and again. I left more on the floor than I brought to the table. And none of them passed. Not a single one of them passed. And not only that, but the Speaker of the House told me to my face that there was never an intention to pass them. There simply wasn't enough time to consider the impact that this was going to have on employers, Teresa. And so it's been a little stressful up there between myself and the newly again appointed Speaker of the House. But I may have been the only one who publicly chose to share my story. Subsequently, someone else had their story shared without her permission, which is a tragedy. But I know I'm not alone. And I know that everything that we do up at that State House is going to start conversations and foster, hopefully, change throughout. We did get mandatory training, although it's not mandated that you actually attend. It's just mandatory that they offer it. But it's these little baby steps. So that's kind of the beginning for me.
Is your speaker a man or a woman?
Yes. A man who describes sexual harassment as budding relationships gone wrong. Yeah, that was nice a lot.
Rhode Island.
So I am from Vermont. I'll use your budding relationships gone wrong as a segue into my experience. So my story begins before #MeToo. Well, all of our stories begin before #MeToo. But the one in particular that ended up leading me to the work that I'm doing now occurred in February of 2017. And by the time the #MeToo movement started, I had signed a settlement agreement with a non-disclosure. That was and my budding relationship was with a prospective employer who was recruiting me. That job, fortunately, has gone by the wayside because better things have come of it. But when I signed my non-disclosure agreement, I had been absolutely assured by the employer that they had done a very thorough investigation and that I was the only woman who this man was a perpetrator against. And that he was moving on, he would no longer be with the company, but that I should have no concerns about signing a non-disclosure because there weren't other women out there who were victim survivors. Fast forward to October of the same year when, out of the blue, I got a message through Facebook from a woman who said, someone told me about what happened to you, and I just wanted to let you know that he did that to me too. So this was right around the time when the Weinstein story came out, and lots of conversations around non-disclosure agreements started happening. I put my name forward to be on Vermont Women's Commission because I felt like the best way for me to move forward after what happened was to try to find positive ways to affect change. That was the process I was going to go through to heal. So that was one of the things that I did. I was very fortunate that because of the Women's Commission and because of Sarah Copeland-Hanzas, I was invited to be part of the conversation about the legislation that Vermont was going to propose. And we heard earlier the importance of having survivors be part of that conversation because there are just, particularly if you've gone through the legal process, there are things that you only know having gone through that process. So there were things that I was able to talk about with non-disclosures and do not darken my door clauses. I don't know if everyone's familiar with those, but that is a permanent no rehire component that is in a lot of sexual harassment settlement agreements that says that the survivor will never again put herself or himself forward for a position with that company. Those very rarely are applied to the perpetrator if he stays with the company. So the victim is re-victimized by being told, and we might get into this more deeply, but they're incredibly broad because it doesn't just apply to that individual company. It's their affiliates and subsidiaries, and when you start looking at how massive those become, particularly for women in service industry jobs, many hotel chains are far bigger than you realize, so you could even move to another state and find out you're now working for someone you weren't supposed to be working for because they are somehow affiliated with a hotel that you were working at in Stowe, Vermont. So it was wonderful to be invited to the table and work with Representative Copeland-Hanzas. I will let her talk about what Vermont was able to accomplish. We are incredibly fortunate. It was certainly through a tremendous amount of hard work, but there was tripartisan interest in doing something in Vermont, and we were able to do it.
The awakening of Me Too in Vermont came on the heels of a pretty high-profile arrest of a Vermont state senator for sexual assault and involving an intern who had been working with him at the State House. And I say that only to help you understand that there was a lot, we had been doing a lot of reflecting on, oh my God, shouldn't we all have known that this relationship between this 60-something senator and this 18 or 20-year-old intern was, shouldn't we have all known? So there's a lot of sensitivity around these issues and a great desire to make sure that we weren't within our institution protecting that kind of predatory behavior. But unlike Teresa's experience, when the reporter called me, I let it go to voicemail. And then I immediately called a couple of my female colleagues who I knew had also had experiences with sexual harassment in the State House. And we talked a lot about whether we wanted to share our stories, and I wasn't really inclined to be kind of the face of sexual harassment. But what I recognized is that I wasn't putting myself in any sort of danger. I wasn't worried about myself or my future, and I felt an obligation to stand up and speak about it. But we decided that we would make sure we weren't outing the people who were the perpetrators in that sense, because we wanted to use this to prompt a bigger conversation. And so I don't know if it was October, November, December, there was a pretty big piece in a statewide media outlet with pictures of 3 or 4 of us telling our stories of harassment and how we dealt with it in the State House, and how Vermont's legislature has kind of evolved into the prevention training that we do and require for legislators. But I used that opportunity to say, look, this shouldn't be about me. I'm a big girl. I'm an elected official. I have an honorable in front of my name. I'm worried about the person who's working in the restaurant down the street. I'm worried about the woman who, is working at that, that auto mechanics shop or that factory floor. Those are the people who don't have the ability to turn to their legislative leadership and say, hey, he just grabbed my ass and you need to tell him to stop, or he might not like the reaction that he gets the next time he does it. Those are the women who don't have the ability to put an end to that harassment. And oh my gosh, wouldn't it be really great if we use this moment in time and this focus and this energy, because everybody wants to know, oh, what's the salacious detail about all of these elected officials? Everybody wants to know about that. But what I wanted to say is, it is everywhere. It doesn't matter that it happened to me. It doesn't matter that it happened to another representative, young woman in the State House. What matters is that it's happening everywhere. And what can we do with this moment in time and with this energy to essentially level the playing field so that every woman has the ability to say knock it off to her harasser, the way I was able to. And so I kind of was sitting around, in the weeks after the Me Too movement really kind of exploded, sitting around waiting for somebody to come up with a legislative idea. And every once in a while I'd call up a colleague and say, okay, so we're going back to session in January, you planning on doing anything? And everybody was like, I don't know. I mean, that just seems so hard and so difficult and oh my God, and heart-wrenching and crap. So I started making calls, and I called Andrea and called the Women's Commission, and I called a bunch of other people, and just basically called anybody that I could get to chat with through some of these issues with me, and Lisa was really helpful. It is very helpful to have the perspective of somebody who has gone through this and have them informing the policy decisions that you're making. Because what is most important in what we were able to accomplish, it is in righting some of those imbalances that women have in the workplace to be able to put an end to that harassment. And I wouldn't have known nearly enough about how many imbalances exist out there if it wasn't for this woman right here. So I give her a great deal of credit, and during the process, she was also a godsend because she was able to come to the State House and sit in on committee. And she would be giving me blow-by-blow updates on what was going on in committee testimony whenever I couldn't be there. So it was really valuable to to say that we were dogged. We really did, and it took that kind of persistence. But I would just encourage all of you to consider the framing it as leveling the playing field made it less threatening to people. And then I went to each of the caucus leaders in the Vermont House, two of whom happened to be men and two of whom happened to be women. Well, the independents don't really have a leader, but I picked my favorite independent and made her the independents leader. So we had gender balance within the primary sponsorship of the bill. And when you have all caucus leadership signed on to a bill like that, boy, it gives it a lot of momentum. And so those were some of the tricks that we used, and I'd love to talk more about what's next on the horizon.
Can you just describe the key points of the bill?
Yes, absolutely. One of the biggest accomplishments, I think, of the bill is in making sure that sexual harassment or that kind of discrimination protections apply to all workers. Because if you're an independent contractor, your only recourse before this bill passed is to walk away from the job. And there was no express protections for people who are volunteers or interns. And so we went around and around and around about whether we wanted to dive into definition of independent contractor, which gets into a lot of sticky employment law issues that I really didn't want to get into. But in the end, I think we took a cue from the Maine Playbook, which was to simply declare that everyone has the right to work in an environment free of sexual harassment, which was an easy way to do it. So we worked long and hard on issues around non-disclosure agreements and binding arbitration in pre-employment. Those were we were told by many employment law folks that, we don't ever see NDAs in pre-employment contracts, that's just not a problem. And I was like, well, good then, because we're putting putting it in here, and it doesn't you won't even miss it. So making sure that you know the deck isn't stacked before you even start working somewhere. Don't sign away your rights before you even know whether you have any serial predators working in your establishment. We asked the AG's office to enhance their reporting mechanism to make it easier for people to know where to go if they're experiencing workplace harassment, and also to make it more user-friendly for folks to do that, even if you are a bystander, to be able to call the AG's office and say, look, this is an incident happening in my workplace, and I don't think it's quite right. It just so happens that our AG's office had just hired on an extra attorney, and so she took on the leadership of that aspect of the Civil Rights Division work, which I think will be very helpful. What else am I forgetting about?
Very late in the process, we received an appropriation attached to the bill, which was terrifying in the moment, because if any of you work in any of your state houses, you know that if suddenly close to the end of the session money gets attached to your bill, there's a greater chance that people are going to have a problem with your bill. But that ended up going through, and that is now a charge of the Women's Commission in the state to work with the Attorney General's office to create an education program to get out the details of the new law, what the rights and responsibilities are for employees and employers, but also to create sort of a central hub for information, and with the primary goal of culture change within organizations, to not just focus on sexual harassment, but we know that where there's racial discrimination, where there's LGBTQ discrimination, there is sexual discrimination, and when you change the culture on one issue, it has the effect of improving the culture overall for all these different groups. So that's one of the goals of the Women's Commission this year.
Excellent. Team effort.
Yeah. Maine.
I do want to argue that the most recent round of public discussion around sexual harassment, I think, dates to Donald Trump. Not only Harvey Weinstein.
Oh, yeah.
And it's certainly, I was seeing in my circles people telling their stories on Facebook beginning in 2016. Maine has had an anti-sexual harassment statute since 1991. And I had the fun of researching it this week. It stemmed from the organization that I work for, the Maine Women's Lobby, which is an advocacy organization for women, obviously. Led a task force which toured the state. It was intended to hear the needs of women as a means of encouraging women to move into non-traditional occupations. And they didn't have a predisposed expectation about what people would bring up, but sexual harassment was overwhelmingly the message that was the concern. So the bill was filed and voted out unanimously. The bill jacket was signed by a Republican. And the most compelling testimony that I read came from the former Commissioner of Transportation, talking about the need to move women into non-traditional occupations and the experiences of companies where such policies had been put in place and that they saved money because you don't have turnover. So we've had that for a long time. 27 years. Is it perfect? No. I learned today that it's far from the strongest in the country, so there are tweaks to be made. But most recently, it exempted the legislature. So your story is familiar. A guy put in a bill. I don't actually know why he put it in. It was, my organization nor any that I know didn't ask him to do it. But organically, the women lobbyists started coming forward and telling their stories. So we had a pretty interesting public hearing in front of, quite frankly, the committee that's not maybe the most progressive committee. But people, just got up and told their stories one by one. And these guys were kind of set back on their heels. It was a pretty funny discussion once we got into the Q&A section, and they're like, You mean if I tell you look pretty today, that's sexual harassment? You know, and this kind of went back and forth with one guy saying, well, maybe you all need to dress more modestly.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
You know, it was fairly appalling. But
Wow.
then they passed it like that.
What did the bill do?
It required that legislators have to
Okay.
undergo the same training that all people who work in
Thank you.
a business with more than 15 undergo. And today is the first training to take place,
Oh.
so that'll be interesting. And interestingly, one other thing that took place was the chair of the committee is a retired state trooper who said, you know, this crosses gender lines, and we don't always talk about it, but the guys get harassed. So that was interesting, and then it just kind of silently flew through the rest of the legislation. There was never any pushback after that.
I think given what you've been speaking about, I'm going to jump to a question later that I had planned for later about men and their role in the Me Too movement as allies or as roadblocks. What has the experience been in your state?
Most recently, I found that men are trying to co-opt the issue, and we're having a big fight over the re-election of our speaker, and there's a lot of progressive allies who I counted on in the past who didn't speak up loud enough back when I was trying to get the bills passed, who are voting for the speaker now, and their constituents are railing against them. And so now they're like, no, I'm putting in legislation to do this, I'm putting in legislation. And now the women are calling them out. Like, Rep. Tanzi already did that, so maybe you just need to get behind her and support her. But honestly, it's been a real education process. I mean, your leadership had women in it. My leadership doesn't. You know, Maine has a mandate that they have a vote on every bill. We don't. So there are little nuances in why some bills may have passed and why some haven't, but the role that men have played so far, they haven't taken it as seriously as they need to. And, you know, I welcome their support. I welcome to get behind my commission and not start their own damn commission, which is what they're trying to do right now. But, you know, really allow the voice of those who have experienced it, that kind of trauma-informed, approach to solutions is what I think is really going to make a difference. So.
Others have thoughts?
So the continuation of my experience was after this other woman came forward, waited quite a while for her to decide what she wanted to do. I put her in touch with legal counsel, and she ultimately decided that she was going to file suit when she wasn't able to reach an agreement with the company. After she filed suit, I wrote a piece for the Daily Beast that I published about my experience, and the company says I broke my NDA. Personally, I think we had a non-operable agreement at that point, both because I think it was entered into in bad faith, but also because I know that there were people from within the company who were already talking about it in my community. So my whole story ended up becoming public, so that my perspective is less from the legislative, but more in a small town, what the reaction is when something like this explodes. And it's been really interesting. I wouldn't say there has been more negative blowback from men than there has been from women. And it's far more positive than negative, which has been wonderful. But it does, it interrupts people's social groups. And it makes people very uncomfortable. And people end up in situations where they feel they need to choose sides. And sometimes perpetrators and survivors have children who go to school together, and that becomes even more complicated. So in my experience, it's fallen more in social lines. There have been a lot of women whose reaction is, and I think this is really just kind of psychologically something that makes sense. When it is a person in your community who is well known, who who you learn is a perpetrator, it is incredibly disconcerting, because suddenly you feel like, if I didn't see it in him, how many other people around me are threats and I can't see it. So there's a lot of pushback in wanting to believe that that person really could have done that, because it makes you feel less safe, even though you have not been victimized. So there was that from women, and from men, close friends of his, deep struggles with, how didn't I see this about this person? And going back, I think a lot of men have been spending a lot of time going back through experiences that they've had and conduct that they've engaged in, and had to have pretty difficult internal conversations with themselves about how many times they fell into this category and didn't realize that they did, or didn't care that they did. But so that, I think there are times when men want to be able to show more support than they do, and in part they don't, for fear of being called out. You know, how can you say you're better than this? I know you did that. So there's that concern. I assume at some point that's going to start to wane. I have two sons who are 18 and 20. One's in college, one's a senior in high school in the town that we're in, and he has just started a sexual assault and harassment prevention club in his school. So I know it's trickling down. But that next generation, they're getting it more. They get it more with, you know, for them, marriage equality is something they just get. And these, you know, it's not going to be perfect when they take over, but there's progress, and it's going to continue to happen no matter who's on the Supreme Court, no matter who's in the White House. It's going to keep happening, because that's how cultural change works.
Do you have anything?
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, because I don't have much to talk that for Vermont.
Well, I should have mentioned that our bill also applies to lobbyists. And as I did say that men have been involved in both of the statutes that I mentioned. But I don't think that what we've done well yet is teach people the connection between money and power. And so, for example, we had passed by Citizen Initiative a measure which included the phase out of the tipped wage, and the legislature simply came in and took that away. And we failed badly to help people understand that harassment is rampant in the restaurant industry, and name another field where you have to tolerate sexual harassment in order to put food on the table.
May I ask a question? How did your state, and particularly the men in your state, react to your senator's response to the Supreme Court that the reason she voted for him was because, she believed the victim, but she just had a wrong memory. It was the wrong person.
I haven't had a lot of conversations with people I don't agree with on that issue. It's just too raw for me.
Have you heard
it divides on party lines. I actually had to walk away from her staffer at a recent event because I couldn't have that conversation.
I was just curious, because it seemed to me that it was one of the more inane comments I've ever heard in my life. When somebody who was
not inane.
How did you distill it to one? Because she spoke for like 45 minutes.
Well,
she did dirty work. She did Mitch McConnell's dirty work.
I don't want to.
So I actually had a question somewhat on that, and I'll broaden it out just about how do you think the debate around the Kavanaugh hearings and the outpouring of support that we saw behind, in solidarity behind Dr. Blasey Ford and Believe survivors, how has that impacted your efforts to strengthen sexual harassment laws in your state? Or have you seen more grassroots energy now as a result? And I'm looking at you because I know a lot of that was focused on Maine because of Senator Collins. Is this energy that is continuing? Do you think it's kind of changed the Me Too conversation in your state?
I think you can't discount the election results. Its impact on our election was profound, and I saw people who had never been engaged in politics driving 2 hours to canvass I saw people, I could start listing the people I know who've said, I have voted for her, but I won't never vote for her again. And the groundswell of engagement has just been.
What's her term?
2020.
2020.
That's Susan Rice.
So
I'll be up there working with you.
So I would say that I would venture a guess that it might make it possible for us to pick up a few of the things that we had to leave on the cutting room floor in Vermont, because we couldn't get consensus around a couple of different issues with respect to this leveling the playing field. You know, we don't have, my hope was that we could have an NDA out, so that if you find that you signed an NDA with somebody who has subsequently harassed other people, that should be an automatic, you know, done, it's over. You know, if you sign an agreement in good faith, thinking that the harasser was, you know, has learned a lesson and found that he hasn't, to me that only seems fair. So I don't think that we've finished our work on that, but I think it's going to take a little bit more energy and a little bit more of an engagement on the part of people who've experienced this in order to push that. I think the reality is, though, that we don't have, there's a power imbalance, but it's related to money. And so if you are being harassed in the workplace, many women don't have the wherewithal to hire an attorney to represent them. Yet the corporation is going to represent their interests and you know, by default, often the interest of the person who's done the harassing. And so we need to think very clearly about how we are publicly funding this equal access to justice. And to me, I think we ought to put a surcharge on all sexual harassment settlements paid by the company to the victims. But that was one of those issues that wasn't going to be universally agreed upon, so I left that one on the cutting room floor. But it only seems fair that we think long and hard about how to publicly fund the legal defense of people who have been harassed. And also tracking of the extent to which there are allegations of harassment or that settlements are happening. And so in our bill, we require the Superior Court to report to the AG's office if there are cases of sexual harassment that make it to the court. But we know that there's a lot of settlements that happen quietly behind closed doors, and I don't necessarily want to know, you know, the details of, you know, who the individuals were in those sexual harassment settlements. But if we don't know the extent to which companies are even entering into settlements, we don't know where the problems are. And if we always are satisfied with just kind of quietly letting this go by the wayside, because it's, you know, because we don't want to have to talk about those sorts of things, how are we ever going to know, you know, how deeply and how pervasive the problem is? So I think we need to do more in the way of tracking. And so we'll see if the energy around the Kavanaugh hearing emboldens people to continue engaging in this. I certainly hope that they do.
I'll be the downer, as usual. We did a poll, I'd say 2 or 3 months after I disclosed, and all of the media sensation had kind of died down a little bit. And 85% of Rhode Islanders, 85% believe that sexual harassment was a significant issue. With that broad support, we couldn't get a single bill passed. I decided not to do the omnibus because I thought it's too easy to just kill an omnibus. So I did individual bills, like some pretty basic ones, like reporting. Like if you're a state agency, you're currently required to report, but we wanted to put something that says you're extra required now and actually make sure they follow through. We couldn't get that. we wanted people who were applying for state contracts to disclose whether or not they had any, settlements. Extending the time frame that they could bring a claim. Making it so that it was not 4 or less employees, but all employees who were defined in the definition of an employee. Making it so that domestic workers were no longer exempt. So just because you happen to be a nanny or a house cleaner or a gardener, it didn't matter to anyone that you were discriminated against because of your race, your gender, whatever it was. That's the way the law works in Rhode Island right now. And we couldn't even get the most basic things changed. It is, we got 6 new women in the House of Representatives elected, which is awesome. And some of them are here today, and I'm so thrilled about that. We worked our butts off and had some amazing candidates step up, really because of what had happened with the election in 2016. Fully half of our chamber in the Senate is women.
Wow.
In the House. But it's one person who runs our entire chamber. And that one man, again, does not understand. One of the cases that was brought to his attention, he's like, oh, I separated them. As if it were 2 children fighting over a Tonka truck, And he thought that was dealing with it. Known or should have known you're supposed to take immediate and appropriate corrective action. And this man is above the law. He's immune. Like, I can't tell you the statements that he was just on public radio this morning. So at 5 o'clock, I was listening to these things going, oh my gosh. So I feel like he has superpowers that, like, nothing will stick on him, and he can prevent and, like, change the shade of, like, gray.
Why is he immune?
I don't know. So we've created a very large coalition of individuals who came up to fight for these bills. We elected a bunch of new people. We have a very strong Women's Democratic Caucus that is constantly speaking up and speaking out. We had, I think, 17 organizations sign on to a bill calling on the Speaker to pass these laws. And he defines women as a special interest. Yes, we do. Yeah. So, I feel like we could be loud. We're going to continue our efforts. We're going to try to raise awareness. We're going to, do everything we can. But it just seems like nothing is gonna happen in my state. I'm not sure what more can happen, but we're going to work on it.
Yeah, we'll talk.
So I have a lot more questions, but I have a sense that this group has a lot of questions too. I don't know where I'm getting that sense, but so I'm just going to ask one more question to kind of end in a high note, if possible, which I know is very challenging in this time. But what opportunities do you see, or plans do you have, going forward to make real lasting change? Which it might not happen, but what are the positive things we're going to work on going forward?
As I said earlier, one of the things that we work on in our organization is trying to help people understand that money is the overarching issue for women, that everything else gets shaped by whether or not you have money. And so the opportunities that we have in the near term are about paid family leave, paid sick days, affordable childcare, strategies to help everybody across the board be better off economically, so that you can't tell your boss to stop it.
Amen.
So I have 3 daughters who are about the same age as Lisa's kids, and so very fun to hear about her son's activity. But when I was telling my daughters that I was going to introduce this bill, I wanted to give them a heads up so that if they started seeing reports in the media, or if there was some sort of backlash, because you never know when the wolves might come out and try to wreak some retribution against those uppity women. So I wanted them to know what was going on, and I was explaining the issue and explaining what had happened to me, and so my middle daughter said, well, Mom, like, what about high school kids? Our first, my first experience being harassed was, in the halls at high school. And that got me thinking, we have a lot of work that we need to do to help promote this cultural shift, and again, it comes back to empowering women to be able to, in that moment, say that was unwanted and unwelcome, right over there.
And the boys too.
And that,
stay.
and that,
Yes.
and that saying "knock it off" is going to stick, and so that has brought me into a number of conversations around young adults and how they
Great.
make decisions in their early adult life, and so I think that's where I will concentrate some energy in the future.
When I went through this process with my attorney, who I had known ahead of time, we got to be really you share a lot. We got to be really good friends, and he and his wife and 2 children came up and spent about 2.5 months in Vermont. He was living in Manhattan at that time. And this was after my settlement. This was over the summer last year. And we spent a lot of time sitting around the fire talking about what else can we do, what do we want to do next, and what has this meant for the direction of both of our lives. So it's not the type of law that he generally practiced. He would occasionally take for, if someone who was close to a referral, he would do a sexual harassment case. And we decided last August that we wanted to launch a company that would focus on working primarily with businesses and investors to, I think it's important on these issues to try to attack things from different angles, because there are going to be different things that move different groups of people. And for business owners and investors, what really moves them is that it is really good for your bottom line not to have sexual harassment happening in the workplace for all sorts of reasons, for turnover and recruiting and lawsuits and public image. So we now work with investment groups, individual investors, if they are considering putting money into a company. Part of the due diligence that they now do is that they want a thorough look at any sexual harassment issues that might be going on in a company that they're thinking about sinking money into. Because nobody wants to find out after you close a deal that you're going to have a sexual harassment bomb go off. And also working with companies who want to prepare themselves either to go to the next stage of getting capital investments, or just trying to grow the business, to let them know where the red flags are. And because both reputationally and financially it's the right thing to do, not just the morally right thing to do, the response has been really positive, which is incredibly encouraging. My bottom line philosophy on people doing the right thing is I really don't care why you do it. I don't care if it's in your best interest. I don't care if it makes you more money. I don't care if it's because you like to tell all your friends at cocktail parties what a good person you are. As long as you're doing the right thing, that's still doing the right thing. So if that gets us there, so be it.
Great.
I have to look to 2020, sadly. And I mean, I'm going to push my bills. I'm going to work them for the next 2 years solid. But I know that every time that we're told no, that the bills are going nowhere, that we're just getting one more candidate ginned up to run against one of these people who does not get it. And, I came into, even before I was elected myself, I worked to get other women elected and worked on policy issues. So those are the 2 things I know how to do, right? Work on policy issues, get more women elected. I'm going to be doing both of those things until this is a reality. And I'm just going to continue to force those really difficult conversations and continue to hold people accountable. So that's my, just...
Thank you. Okay, so we've left a good chunk of time for questions, and go ahead.
So I'm privileged to know Teresa. And so we asked about how men have affected what's happened. I've been mostly disappointed in how women have responded to some of this. Like a little person saying, well, what about our son? Well, I have one of each, and I have had conversations with both of them about what yes is and what yes is not. And so I'm appalled by that, but I also think that as women, we need to, I'm appalled that Teresa had no From a little backup that I can give her, I have tried to. But you know, I've been in a situation, and it's so true about money and power, where so I'm a nurse practitioner in a private practice. One of the physicians was absolutely harassing pharmaceutical reps. And they didn't feel the power to say anything. And so I went corporate and said, not naming any names, just being very vague, and said, this is happening, and it's bad, and you're gonna get a lawsuit. Like, I didn't put out the deal to their bottom line, because I'm gonna file it soon if they don't. And so I think we have, as women, we have to step up and use our power to help either other women or our voices, and just, I'm interested in hearing how women have or have not done that. Because by the way, when he was confronted by that, he's like, well, why do you think these companies hire those hot women for that job? Yeah, so like he totally got to it. Like it was amazing. So I think that someone recording what happened. We were to start recording. CEO, president of the company, they were there. Like it was
Yeah.
So how are women responding?
You know, I've had the gamut. I've had everything from a woman who's approaching 70 say to me, oh, I would give anything to be sexually harassed because no one pays any attention to me, to women saying, you know, you never named your harasser because to me it was important that the issue not be about what happened to me specifically, but that it exists. To, you know, like just not believing. So everything that you've heard about Dr. Blasey Ford is you know, it's the same, no matter how small or how large the instances. I think what we can do is, in the workshop prior to this, work on some key phrases that you have set in your mind that you know you're going to experience this. The same person does it time and again, where you can say something. If you don't want to intervene in that moment, you take the person, the offender, you know, aside after the fact and say, by the way, that made me really uncomfortable, what you just said. So I can only imagine what that person who can't speak against you because their job depends upon the relationship with you, like being that voice for them. And at the very least, if you're not comfortable doing either of those things, go talk to the woman or the person who you just saw being sexually harassed and say, that was painful for me to watch. And I don't know if that made you uncomfortable, but I want you to know that you were treated poorly. And I'm so, you know, sorry that that happened. And, you know, I wish I had the, you know, the gumption to, or whatever it is. I wish I could say something to that person's boss, or just solidarity. I do believe that as individuals, we have the power to make those interactions stop 70% of the time, because people don't get called out on it. You know, like even my own husband one night, we were out at a restaurant. It wasn't like a sexually offensive joke. It was just stupid. Like the woman is serving you your dinner. Like, don't make stupid banter back and forth. Let her go do her job. And he's like, well, she laughed. And I said, well, she had to laugh.
Between 15 and 20%.
Exactly. I'm like,
That's
taking
why I
the
wanted to
opportunity,
read, yep.
to just like, even if it's not a sexual harassment opportunity, just to say that person can't speak up. They're not empowered to react to you in a way, so you have to be the one to police your own actions.
Yeah, Sarah and I talked about this before the session today, and piggyback on what you were saying. There are those of us who are in a position where we're able to say something, and there are women who aren't. And that doesn't just mean you've reached a certain point in your career or financial stability or whatever. There are emotional reasons that, you know, some people can speak up and some can't. Some people, it's their personality. If it's your personality, if you're either someone who's willing and able to take a risk, or you're in a position where it's not a risk to say something, then I do think that we have a responsibility to speak up. At the same time, nobody owes anybody their story. And women who have experienced sexual harassment or assault should never feel any pressure. One of the really unexpected things that happened between me and women I am close to, and some women I didn't know, was because I had gone public about what happened to me, the amount of guilt that made other women feel because they hadn't. And I really struggled with how to talk to women about that, and it finally occurred to me, my first experience with sexual harassment was when I was 15. I spoke up when I was 48. Right. So I had a whole lot of years of not saying anything, and there was nothing wrong with that, because I chose, for whatever reason, it wasn't right for me to speak up at that time. So there's no more shame in me not speaking up all those other times than anybody else who hasn't decided that they want to be public about these things. So it's a very individual decision, but yeah, bystanders, male and female, when we have an opportunity to do it, we have to step in, and we were discussing before, there are usually multiple people who witness these things. If one person does, there are a few people seeing it. Most of the people witnessing are uncomfortable with what they're seeing. They're just waiting for somebody to say something, because nobody wants to be the first person. And I think, look, we teach all of our kids in school that they should be speaking up when somebody's being bullied, and then we get into professional positions and we no longer do what we tell our children that they should be doing. And so, when we have an opportunity to do it, we should be.
Other question?
So I'm a student from West Boston, and I'm actually 20, so I'm the age of you. I work within, I'm an intern with the Title IX investigator at my university, and I have the fortunate position of having a seat within the committee in Title IX. So I've been really trying to use that platform and my network to cultivate change on campus. And I even have an even more unique position where I'm one of the first RAs at the residential halls that were just built. So I've been able to kind of work with that code of conduct, work with implementing Title IX. And I guess just from that standpoint and looking forward, obviously I hope to be of the same position one day as many of you. Like what can I do in my position now, and what can I look to do in the future, and how can I use my platform to also advocate?
Whoa. So what an exciting time to be working in Title IX issues in a university. I have been contacted by campus sexual assault survivors in Vermont because of the work that I did on the sexual harassment bill, asking me to look into some of the sticky issues. And with the new rules being released by the Trump administration and changes to Title IX, I think it's an important time for all of us to engage in this.
Yes.
And remember that Title IX is meant to protect people's equal access to education. And we need to recognize that with respect to young adults who are first experiencing freedom, maybe first experiencing alcohol use and the ability to have intimate relations with people a little more freely than they probably did in high school. There's a lot of opportunity for education in that setting, and the one thing that I hope that we can do is really think of it in terms of, how do we create a better culture around consent and around when is somebody able to consent. That's going to be a sticky conversation that universities, I think, will be having for a long time. So you are right in the middle of a pretty exciting developing situation. As I was looking at it from Vermont, and I'm really only just starting to dabble in this, I'm thinking, oh my God, if the Trump administration is going to roll back protections for women on college campuses, what can we do as a state to make sure that we're backstopping that? And so if you have any ideas, because I think, honestly, the states are going to have to lead. I mean, nobody thinks that this predator-in-chief is going to protect women in college campuses, and it needs to not be. I mean, we need to recognize that the best possible outcome of these conversations around campus sexual assault and consent and all of that will be the cultural change of really, helping these young adults to learn the appropriate way to interact with each other. And it's not about, it's not about, that poor boy, you're going to ruin his educational career. He's such a good football player. But recognizing that the purpose of Title IX is to protect everybody's access to education, and it's pretty hard to learn if you're worried about the serial assaulter down the hall.
I'll just make a plug quickly on the Title IX rules that have just come out. The Law Center is doing a lot of activating around that because there's a 60-day comment period, and everybody can write in and comment about those. So you can go on our website, nwlc.org, and sign up for action alerts and emails, and that will get you connected to advocating for, against the rules that have come out.
Say the website again, a little slower.
nwlc.org, so National Women's Law Center, nwlc.org. And I saw you a question back there.
Thank you for this panel. I have a question, and I want to applaud you for talking about how you tried to make change in your situation by moving forward and being involved. I have a very similar situation where I tried to get access to justice and was put through a very humiliating, painful, long process that resulted in talking about the complicated nature of the situation, not based just on my gender, but on my race. And so I wanted to know if you could talk about how do, and Andrea, maybe you can speak to, in terms of women of color, trying to pursue justice when our laws are not, and our policies are typically not intersectional. And I had a very high-profile attorney tell me that the one thing that she hates when it comes to her sisters of color is that sometimes it's very difficult because your case is not racial enough to pursue it under Title VI, and it's not sexual enough to pursue it under Title IX. And so I was just wondering if we could talk about that, because that's something that I still have yet to reconcile on a personal level. It kills me every day. But I think just as someone who is trying to be a part of this work and trying to have these conversations to help other women, that's a milestone that constantly gets brought up.
I'm not going to attempt to speak to how much more difficult it is for a woman of color to be able to pursue justice, because I don't have that experience, and I don't have a lived experience of what that's like. I can certainly speak to what it is like to be believed as a woman, and the comment that you made about the harassment was not bad enough is that for all the good that I think the Weinstein cases coming forward has done and prompted these conversations, because so many of them were so violent and so egregious, I think it has allowed a lot of people to feel that offenses on the other end of the violent spectrum aren't valid. And it's just not true. There is no, it's not bad enough. Unfortunately, there are legal hurdles that you have to, be able to reach as a minimum for what qualifies as sexual harassment. But the idea that, harassment needs to be assault is legally incorrect, morally incorrect. I'll let you speak more to that.
Yeah, so so glad that you asked that question, because this is a point that we've been trying to make a lot in responding, the policy response to the Me Too movement. So we've seen a lot of legislation focused narrowly on sexual harassment. And, that's in part because that's what the conversation in the media is really focused on. And then, political considerations to what you can get at the time and everything. But it is so important to realize that this is not just about sex. It's about power and money, definitely, but it's also about race and disability and national origin, and women experience harassment on a variety of, a combination of those factors many times. And just like you said, if you're passing a law that only strengthens our protections for sexual harassment, you might be giving somebody an incomplete remedy. And only partial protection, I think better said. And so, the experience, Black women will experience sexual harassment that will include racial slurs. And so, I'm so glad that you shared your story about that, because that is a point that we try to make a lot, to kind of make folks realize that this is, sexual harassment, it's just make a gender issue is not the full picture. It is very much a race issue as well, combined with race. A lot of times folks will also experience other forms of discrimination along with the sexual harassment. So oftentimes pay discrimination is also happening, because it's all about power. It's all the same thing. And so we think it's really important for protections that are being passed to apply to both harassment and discrimination in all of its forms. So I feel like a broken record a lot of times when I'm making that point, but it is so crucial just for the reason that you shared, and thank you for doing that.
The one thing I'll add is that one of the things we heard testimony about in the State House last year was that in settlement agreements, very often if there is intersectionality in the different charges that are being brought, it's pay, it's racial, it's sexual discrimination, that in a settlement agreement, the most palatable of the three complaints will be the one that the settlement is referred to settling. So that if later on, if this is a state agency that it occurs at, if the settlement agreement is FOIA'd, you ask for all sexual harassment. Well, if that was a pay discrimination settlement ultimately, then we're under reporting and not understanding the true magnitude of these things that are happening. So somehow there has to be a way that that we're not able to just shift this to, it is more acceptable for, we thought we were paying everyone equally, we weren't, this was brought to our attention. That doesn't seem so bad, versus, it was also, the reason that she was not being paid as much was also because of her race, and also because we had someone who was sexually harassing.
Are there other questions?
I heard you say earlier, and I heard Chandler Burke say earlier, this idea of, we have this small window right now, we have this moment. I work for the Mass State Legislature, so I know how hard it is to pass a bill, even if you have a public conversation, especially when there isn't. But how do we say, no, this window's open for good, and we're not leaving until something happens?
Run for office.
State access.
It's so important, though. I mean, a part of the reason why I stuck to my narrow focus was because I didn't want to create a pendulum swing where there was going to be a backlash later about, and really, kind of being able to say, we need to take this conversation beyond the kind of high-profile, career-ending shaming, because that only helps those people, those famous people. It doesn't help the wait staff. It doesn't help the housekeeper. And so I want to keep the window open, and I think we can. If we decide that we want to keep the window open, we can. Run for office.
Yes. Okay, I think we're about at time. I'll end by just noting that there was sort of a theme appearing, which I've already kind of mentioned, about power, and how, it's not just about sexual harassment. It's about the fact that you're being paid less, either because you're making a tip minimum wage, and we need one fair wage, or you're being discriminated against in your pay, or you don't have access to sick days or a predictable schedule. And that all of those things are making it so you're more vulnerable to harassment, less able to speak up, less financial resources to maybe find an attorney or seek help. And then sexual harassment itself contributes to some of these wage gaps because it keeps women out of higher paying, traditionally male jobs like construction or STEM. So those occupational gaps there, it makes it hard for you to ask for the promotion that you want, that your male, counterpart might just go ahead and do, but you've been harassed. And so it's this vicious cycle. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize that. And when we're looking at policy solutions around sexual harassment, NDAs are really important. And I thank you for sharing that story. And why addressing NDAs is so important, but it's not the end of the story. There's so much more that we need to be doing to strengthen our sexual harassment laws themselves, but also all of these other workplace protections and education. And I'll just make the plug for the Playbook, which I'll leave up here, which we have a sort of legislative agenda for addressing sexual harassment, and it addresses sexual harassment not just in the workplace, but in schools, and what states can do to address harassment in schools, and also in healthcare. Those are stories that we're hearing as well, Me Too stories. And so really connecting the dots on all of these things I think is really important. And yeah.
I'd like to make one last pitch for the issue of the federal courts.
Mm-hmm.
We've all talked about Kavanaugh today, but the Supreme Court, as you know, is just the tip of the iceberg. The federal system is like baseball. It's a field team that comes up through the ranks. And by far the majority of cases go to the lower courts and never reach the Supreme Court. The Trump administration is on track to replace 30% of the judiciary. They are overwhelmingly male, white, and super conservative. Overwhelmingly anti-woman, anti-LGBTQ. It's a very, very serious matter. So we can't just let up and think about only the Supreme Court and Kavanaugh. And obviously we all think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg every single day. Matter a lot. And I said we had a federal judge who made a very important ruling in our state yesterday. So of course not. What would you guys do? Speak to your U.S. senator. They don't hear about this. They do not get feedback on these issues on a daily basis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you.